Decisive Strike has been a part of the game almost since its initial release in the summer of 2016. Today we know it as one of the so-called anti-tunneling perks. When you get unhooked, it activates for 60 seconds. If during this time the killer downs you and picks you up, it allows you to momentarily stun them by hitting a skill check and automatically escape their grasp. After it deactivates until the end of the match. Obviously there's much more nuances to how exactly it works, and we'll get to that later, but for now you get the idea. It's a defensive perk, unlike its release version, which was 100% geared towards offense. It wasn't a completely different perk. If you go through its description, you'll notice that it still implied that you went down and got picked up, and it still required you to hit the skill check to break free. But what you're not gonna find in this description is any mention of what you needed to do to activate it. And that's because you didn't need to do anything. Literally all you had to do was load into the match, and Decisive Strike in all its glory was already at your disposal. This meant that if you were the first survivor the killer ran into in order to get a hook off of you, they essentially had to chase you twice. First time normally, and second after you used Decisive Strike on them. Needless to say, it was a huge time waste for killers. A time waste they couldn't afford, because gen speed back then was much faster. Fixing one gen used to take you only 70 seconds, so any survivor capable of lasting in a chase at least 1 minute could buy their team enough time to fix at least 2 gens, because Decisive Strike automatically doubled their chase time. And now imagine what it was like when they managed to pull off a 2 or better yet a 3-minute chase with the whole team sitting on separate gens. The match would already be over by the time you hooked them for the first time. Realizing the benefit of this scenario, pretty soon good survivors started forcing it by deliberately engaging with the killer as early into the match as possible. This way they ensured that most if not all pallets were still up, which drastically increased their chances of dealing some serious damage before they had to resort to using Decisive Strike. And that's why in the beginning I was talking about the offensiveness of this perk. But wait, wouldn't it be smarter to ignore the Decisive Strike user and go for someone else instead? Yeah, it would, but the problem was that it was impossible to tell who had this perk and who didn't. Today you can define it by simply looking at the survivor icons on the HUD and checking which one of them has the obsession clause around them, because equipping Decisive Strike increases your chances of becoming the obsession by 100%. Yes, it's not a guaranteed telltale, because since patch 4.7.0 the game started forcing one of the survivors to be the obsession even if none of them were running any obsession perks, but at least it's something. Originally you didn't even have that, because back in the day Decisive Strike wasn't obsession based, and thus it didn't mark the survivor icons in any special way. But even if it did, I don't think it would help the situation much, because what would you do? Leave them and go for someone else? Well, good luck with that. Considering how popular this perk was at that time, the chances that the next guy would also have it were practically 100%. For all I know, all 4 survivors in the lobby could have it, so yeah, in most cases you had no choice but to go after the first guy you saw, even if their cocky behavior was screaming Decisive Strike. What made the old Decisive Strike even harder to avoid was the fact that it wasn't timer-based, so killers couldn't just wait it out by slugging you for a while, like they often do on the live servers. If they really wanted to bypass it this way, they would have to completely bleed you out on the floor so that they didn't have to pick you up at all. This process could be significantly sped up if they brought a green or pink Mori, because back then these offerings allowed killers to kill survivors right after the first down without having to hook them even once. I know it sounds crazy and worthy of a separate video, and I am willing to make it, but only if you're gonna subscribe to my channel right now and help me reach 10 likes under this video. It's a tough milestone, I understand, so make sure you show this video to your granny and her cat, because we're gonna need all the help we can get. On top of not having a timer, the release Decisive Strike also didn't deactivate when you interacted with different objects or other players. You know, like with its current version, when it goes away after you touch a gen, start healing, or literally do anything that progresses the game in any way, shape, or form. It made this perk much more flexible and gave survivors complete control over when to use it. For example, they could fix several gens, cleanse a hex totem, I don't know, loot all the chests on the map and still have Decisive Strike at the ready when the killer came for them. In fact, this way they could actually preserve it until the end of the game and secure a guaranteed escape through the exit gates, because even fixing all the gens and powering the exit gates didn't deactivate this perk. Basically, as the killer, the only way you could get rid of Decisive Strike without eating the stun was to make the survivor miss the skill check. I'm not saying you could influence it directly, however, soon killers discovered a pretty weird but nonetheless clever technique that helped them increase the chances of it happening. Namely, when picking up a survivor with Decisive Strike, they started violently shaking their camera in order to potentially lower the FPS on the survivor's end, while also making the skill check arrow a little harder to see. Did it actually help? Well, it did, but certainly not as much as killers wanted. But the fact that people still did it just goes to show how desperate they were to avoid getting stunned by Decisive Strike. This camera jerking thing would be way less widespread among killers if the stun from DS didn't steal so much of their time, but unfortunately it did. First of all, because at that time its duration was not 4 but 5 seconds. I'd love to show you in practice how long it was, but unfortunately every version of old DBD where I tested Decisive Strike resulted in this. Hello? Did it show you the icon?
I see icon.
So, basically the game thinks that I hit the skill check and Decisive Strike activated, and you got stunned, but, like, nothing happened. Noted. Edit. I think we just figured it out. It seems that whenever you're the host and switch to Survivor, Decisive Strike just stops working for some reason. So if you want it to work, you need the killer to invite you to their lobby. Just thought it could be useful for those of you who actually play old DBD like myself. Second, because it occurred about a second later than today, meaning that when you picked the Survivor up, the game allowed you to take a couple of steps, giving you a false impression that you could hook them, and only then the stun would actually come through. Can you think of a more evil way to design a perk? And it would have been even worse if it wasn't for enduring. While this perk didn't change when exactly during the pickup animation the skill check appeared, it directly affected the duration of the stun, reducing it initially by 20% and later by 35%. And that's almost 2 seconds. No wonder back in the day enduring was in every other killer's build. With all that said, a logical question comes to mind. How did BHVR not see all this coming when they were designing Decisive Strike? Was it because of their inexperience? Maybe, but I think there's a chance that they did it on purpose, because in a way survivors needed such a tool. I know it sounds weird after everything I've told you about the old DS, but hear me out. Back in the day, the price of getting hooked even once was much higher than today. In fact, quite often it meant inevitable death, because the game offered next to none anti-camping and anti-tunneling mechanics. That is, no automatic self-unhooking, no post-unhooking endurance, no borrowed time, off-the-record reassurance, nothing. And that's not even to mention that the killer could just stand in front of the hooked survivor and physically block the unhooking prompt, making it impossible to rescue them. Not gonna get into details about all this right now, but if you want to know more, you can watch my video on the detailed history of camping. The link is gonna be in the description. Anyway, with this in mind, the devs most likely saw Decisive Strike as a necessary evil and deliberately designed it so that it helps survivors delay the moment of getting hooked for the first time. Probably the only thing that prevented the old DS from being a perfect perk was the way the skill check was implemented. The thing is, it was much harder to hit because of how jittery it was, and it had nothing to do with how strong your PC was. It displayed at 20 FPS even on the most beefiest high-end systems you could ever imagine. And second, it could literally appear right in front of the arrow, giving you only a fraction of a second to react. Back in the day, we used to refer to this phenomenon as the 4 o'clock skill check. 4 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 4 o'clock, please. Oh! Damn it! Like, I'm not gonna lie, that's probably the first time in my life where I legit got jump scared by a skill check. During that period, busted mechanics in Dead by Daylight weren't something unheard of. However, the introduction of Decisive Strike still came as a shock to many players. That's how overpowered it was. Naturally, leaving this perk in such a state would have been a crime against game balance, so about a month after its release, the devs slowly started bringing it in line. The first change to it was implemented 2 days before the release of the Hag chapter in patch 1.3.0. It reduced the stun duration to 4 seconds, and I know I shouldn't be complaining about it, because technically it was still an improvement. However, I can't help but point out that starting to fix this perk by adjusting the stun duration was a little stupid, because the stun duration wasn't what made it so broken. It was a contributing factor for sure, but not the main reason. The main reason was the fact that it had no proper counterplay. But I guess 1 month was just not enough for BHVR to figure out what to do about it, so they did the next most obvious thing and simply tweaked the stun timer. A much more meaningful change came out in the early 2017. That's when Decisive Strike finally became obsession-based. The idea behind it was to make it so that if several survivors in the lobby had this perk, not all of them were equally immune to being picked up. Long story short, now only the Obsession could use DS immediately after being picked up. The rest of the survivors were first required to progress their wiggle bar to 35%, which in terms of time amounted to 8 seconds. If you've never had a chance to try this version of DS but this description still sounds familiar, it's because the same principle is used in Power Struggle, a perk which allows you to stun the killer with a pallet they're walking by once your wiggle bar reaches 15%. 100%. While this new version of Decisive Strike was indeed a big improvement over its original iteration, I still wouldn't call it healthy, and there's two reasons for this. The first one is on the surface. It allowed the killer to chase 3 survivors out of 4, which wasn't the best scenario for both sides. For killer, cause every time they found the obsession, it made them drop the chase and waste time looking for safer targets. And for survivor, cause if you were the obsession, you were almost guaranteed to be ignored by the killer for the entirety of the match, cause the obsession icon straight up told them to stay away from you. The second reason is that it added unnecessary paranoia to the killer gameplay, cause now whenever you had to carry a non-obsession survivor for more than a few seconds, you always found yourself expecting to be stunned at any moment. And if it did happen, the effect it produced was even more devastating than the effect from a normal DS stun, cause at least normal stuns happened the moment you picked the survivor up and didn't make you waste an additional 8 seconds carrying the survivor to the hook. This version of Decisive Strike had been in the game for about 3 years, and out of all the old versions of this perk, it became the one people remembered the most. So whenever you hear an OG player getting nostalgic about the old DS, chances are they're talking about this version. In the spring of 2019, the Decisive Strike situation changed radically, cause patch 2.6.0 brought us another rework of this perk. In an attempt to once and for all fix its aggressive design, Behavior repurposed it for anti-tunneling. For this, they made it activate for 60 seconds after getting unhooked for all survivors, regardless of whether they were the obsession. Almost like it works today, but with one exception: it still didn't deactivate after touching something. And that was a problem, cause it left a loophole which allowed survivors to continue using this perk offensively. Here is how it worked. After getting unhooked, instead of running away from the killer like the devs expected you to, you were supposed to get right in front of them and start doing a gen or a totem or literally anything else in order to bait them into grabbing you. And when it happened, you got to stun them and escape as usual. Of course, that's provided that the killer didn't choose to ignore you, but if they actually did, well, that was even better, cause this way you got to keep your DS and finish whatever interaction you started. When dealing with such cheeky survivors, killer's best bet was to slug them and try to wait out their DS. And once they realized that pretty much nothing else worked, that's exactly what a lot of them started to do. But it didn't last too long, cause when the strat became too popular on top of Decisive Strike, survivors also started bringing Unbreakable, and at that point, leaving them on the ground was pretty much equivalent to letting them go, cause it allowed them to completely recover from the dying state without the help of their teammates in only 25 seconds. The good news was that in this patch, the devs finally moved the DS skill check right to the beginning of the pickup animation, so that the stun happened immediately after it ended and no longer made killers waste any extra time. Sadly though, this change also killed the so-called juggling tech killers had developed by that time. That's when, upon downing a survivor with Decisive Strike, instead of taking the stun, they did this. Oh wow. Okay. What the hell? That was like 11 o'clock. Yeah, no chance, no chance. Unless it's a 3 o'clock and I can react to that, there's no chance. Oh my god, my wiggle bar is like almost full though. Probably not gonna make it. Okay. Barely though, one more drop and I would be free. Basically, by repeatedly dropping the survivor on the ground, the killer kept cancelling the skill check and didn't allow the stun to happen, while also slowly but surely getting them closer and closer to the hook. Before patch 2.6.0, it worked only if the survivor was in close proximity to the hook, cause there's only so many times you can drop them before they automatically wiggle off. Now that the skill check delay was removed, bypassing Decisive Strike this way became completely impossible, even if the survivor was 1 meter away from the hook. But think of it as a trade-off for being able to catch up with survivors even faster after getting stunned. It was achieved by further reducing the stun duration to 3 seconds, just like it was before the 7.7.0 mid-chapter update. And as a survivor, it was equally as nasty to deal with, cause it barely gave you any time to get to a safe spot before the killer fully recovered and was right behind you ready to down you again. In fact, it was even worse, cause a quick reminder, at that time Decisive Strike was still affected by enduring, and you know what that means. A stun duration so fast that unless you went down right on the pallet, you wouldn't be able to make it anywhere. As you can guess, this version of Decisive Strike didn't stay in the game for too long, because in just 2 weeks the negative feedback from survivors made behavior restore the stun duration back to not even 4 seconds, but 5, just like it was at the release. You might say that they overreacted and should have gone for 4 seconds instead, but truthfully, taking into account the whole enduring thing, I think it was kinda justified. Later that same year, enduring was finally nerfed to no longer mitigate the stun duration of perks, which automatically made it impossible to be used for countering Decisive Strike. The funny thing is that in order to compensate for this, the devs were also supposed to adjust the stun duration of Decisive Strike itself.
But you didn't.
No idea if it was intentional or they simply forgot, but the fact is that for several years it allowed survivors to benefit from 5-second long stuns that couldn't be reduced in any way. In the spring of 2021, the devs finally realized that allowing survivors to keep Decisive Strike after interacting with objects was a bad idea, because it completely ruined their plan of making it into a defensive perk. And that's why in patch 4.6.0 they disallowed it by including every interaction that existed in the game at that time into the list of deactivation conditions. As the game was growing and new mechanics were getting added to it, this list was growing too. For example, when boon perks became a thing, it was expanded with blessing totems. Eventually, for the sake of simplicity, all these conditions were combined under the umbrella term conspicuous actions, which came into use after the first meta shakeup update. Speaking of which, since one of its goals was to tone down the most overused perks in the game, Decisive Strike was absolutely doomed to be butchered by it, because even after all the nerfs it had gone through, its peak rate still remained through the roof. Anyway, meta shakeup update introduced 2 big changes. First of all, it made Decisive Strike completely deactivate after the exit gates were powered, so that killers didn't feel completely helpless trying to stop freshly unhooked survivors from escaping during the endgame. Even though it was yet another massive nerf, I wouldn't say that too many people cried about it. Probably because most of them realized that it was very unfair and that for the sake of the game's health it just had to go. Second, now that enduring was gone, it was time to once again reduce the stun duration. And guess what it was reduced to? 3 seconds. Of course it had to be 3 seconds! It's like, guys, did your past experience really not teach you anything? Remember the last time you made it 3 seconds? It worked so well, right? Maybe they hoped that without enduring it wouldn't be that bad, but it was exactly that bad, because by that time the layouts of most of the maps had changed significantly and generally not in the survivor's favor. The palette density was now like 50% lower, with good tiles being spread apart so much that it created literal dead zones. So quite often with a 3-second long stun, all survivors could count on was this. Alright, let's see what you have. Decisive, dead hard, whatever the fuck. Well, no dead hard, because you vaulted... Decisive, maybe? Yeah. Hey! 2-second stun, man! 2-second stun into a failed 360, brother. Brother, this perk is godlike. Naturally, after such a massive nerf, the popularity of Decisive Strike started declining. Instead, survivors developed an appreciation for off the record, which was buffed in the very same patch. As time went by and killers learned to counter off the record by hitting survivors right off the hook, the need to use Decisive Strike arose again. And that's when people started actively demanding the stun time to be increased to a more usable value, which the devs eventually did. Just recently in patch 7.7.0, they buffed it to... 5 seconds. Dude, I swear, does behavior know any other numbers besides 3 and 5? You started with 5 and it didn't work. Then you went all the way down to 3 and it didn't work too, which somehow didn't stop you from trying it again after some time. And when it didn't work again, what a surprise, you went all the way back to 5 because, I don't know, maybe you thought since you last tried it, seconds have started working differently or something? Guys, listen. 4. The solution to this problem is 4. It's right there. It's right between 3 and 5. How about we try this number for a change? Initially in this patch, we were also promised that from now on, Decisive Strike stuns would feature a unique animation. And at first it got me excited, but then I saw what it looked like. Brother, this delay is just fucking godlike. Basically, on the PTB, the animation was broken beyond belief. And if you're wondering why after 2 months it still didn't make it to the live servers, that's because like many other things from that PTB, it was cancelled, because the devs couldn't figure out how to fix it. Classic behavior L. But give credit where it's due. At least shortly after the 7.7.0 update, they realized that the 5-second stun timer was a mistake, which is why on the recent Vecna PTB, it was reduced to the long-awaited 4 seconds. And let me tell you something, in my opinion, it worked perfectly. It seems to be the golden middle we've been looking for all this time, because it's not too annoying for the killer, yet gives survivors a fair chance to gain some meaningful distance and not die the moment the killer recovers from the stun. Not sure if this patch will be live when you're watching this video, and not sure if the devs are actually gonna keep the stun duration at 4 seconds, but in case they're not, all I wanna know is whether they're gonna go back to 3 seconds or 5.